welcome to your painting demo number 1 for project number 1, our Dutch still lifes. So the first step is to actually set up your still life. Now there's a couple things that you need to think about. First off, like, what objects do you want in your still life? So I just went through, I have a toddler in the house, which means that I have a ton of toys. So I grabbed a bunch of toys, and the toys that I grabbed started to have a theme. I've got things that move, transportation devices. I've got some balls, and then I've got some creatures. So that is the general theme of toys of my house, but I have more than I need. I really want to limit my still life to maybe somewhere between 3 to 5 objects. You also noticed I grabbed a LaCroix. I wanted to drink one, and I thought, oh, maybe I would want to paint one, but it doesn't really fit with the theme. Also, if this is something you might want to be aware of, is what feels generally easy to paint and what is hard to paint. A LaCroix can is surprisingly complicated because it's so reflective and because there's a lot of design on it. And you can simplify the design, but ultimately there's a lot going on with the surface and the texture that makes it hard to paint. So I'm going to put that to the side. Okay, so I've gathered things. There's a couple different ways that we can make a still life feel meaningful. So one of those ways is that the objects themselves have meaning. So for me, I've already themed this still life around toddler toys. And for me, that kind of has extra meaning because it's, you know, it reminds me of my toddler. Although, to be honest, these are his least favorite toys, because another thing that you need to think about when choosing objects is they're objects that need to stay set up in your still life for about 3 to 4 weeks. So I didn't want to pick his favorite toys. Also, because you want them to stay set up for about 3 to 4 weeks, you don't want to pick anything living that will wilt. So live flowers are not ideal. Fruit depends on the fruit. An apple will stay okay for a while. An orange might stay okay. They might not be yummy to eat at the end of this, but ultimately we care about their looks and not their taste, at least for the purposes of this project. But blueberries, fruits that are going to wilt, vegetables that are going to wilt are not as good an idea. If you can get fake versions of those, awesome. Fake flowers, fake fruit, those are great for putting in your still life. Another thing you want to think about is, again, what is, if you hear music or thumping or yelling in the background, that is my toddler. So occasionally on these videos you might hear stuff like that. Yeah, that comes from working from home. So here we are in the basement. He's upstairs with my husband. So he's not just running around upstairs on his own. Anyways, back to this. Think through the relative complexity of what you are, the objects that you are choosing. If you are a confident painter, go forward with the hard objects. If you are at the beginning level, choose some simple objects. So what are things that are harder to paint? Things that are see-through. So like a glass vase. Initially we think of like a glass vase as being wonderful, but if you can see through it, that provides reflection and opacity. It makes it just more complicated. It can be fun, but it's more complicated. Again, this ball is see-through just by nature of having the open holes, which makes it's going to be more complicated. If I were to paint it in front of this, I have to figure out how to paint this and this around it while seeing through it. Whereas if I have an opaque object just in front of it, it's a lot easier. So I might put this ball aside as being too complicated. Another thing that is lovely to have in a still life but is complicated are flowers. With the exception of maybe tulips, flowers that have a lot of petals, a lot of leaves, they often have like color gradient changes, which is what makes flowers beautiful and what makes them hard to paint. So again, just be aware of the objects that you're choosing. It's fun to have a variety, but also like we want you to feel successful in this painting. So choosing objects that will help it be successful. Now I've got objects that all have some sort of unified meaning, but how I arrange them can also both contribute to the meaning and contribute to what we call a dynamic composition. So one of the things I've done to help my composition be good is you'll notice I've got that box of wipes. So I'm not going to paint the box of wipes, but what it does is I'm actually going to set things on top of the box of wipes. And that allows me a elevated surface so that when I look at the still life, I'm looking at it straight on. I'm not looking down at the still life. If you notice all the examples of still lifes that we looked at, they're always at eye level. And so we want to elevate the still life. So just find any sort of box, elevate it so that you can paint the still life at eye level. The other thing I've done is I've just put a white sheet of paper on the bottom and behind. That makes for a simple surface and a simple background. You don't have to do white, but it's generally the best. If you do a dark background, it feels more moody, but white allows for color and form to play. Up to you. If you know you want a certain color in your background, you can find a colored piece of paper. But if you have white, you can always still paint the background dark. You can still paint the background a certain color. It just helps eliminate confusion when you're looking at the still life. Okay, so I have a place to put my still life. I have objects to play with. What I'm going to do now is just play around with what does it look like when I put things in different places. If you see me, I still have I've got my painting apron on because I've just been painting and I'm going to keep painting. So anyways, that's that big giant green thing that I'm wearing. Okay, so I'm going to start with dump truck because it's big and it's fun. So one of the things that I can do to make it more dynamic is to put it at an angle instead of putting it straight on. And that actually, when you put things at an angle, it helps you see what's going on. It makes the three-dimensional form easier to paint. And then so now I'm just gonna kind of like, once I've got something started, so I'm gonna try my little troll doll that comes from Denmark. I've never been to Denmark, but I'd like to go. See what happens if I put him in the bed of the dump truck. And again, remember, we can make story by creating, by how we place things together. So why is the troll in the dump truck? Is the troll about to get trashed? Is the turtle stopping the dump truck and saving his friend, the troll? I don't know. What happens if we put the ball in the dump truck? So I'm trying to I want to create a height differential, again, because composition will be more interesting, but I also want to create relationship between the objects. If I put it here. What if the troll and the otter are hugging? Oh, I've got a boat and a dolphin. Okay, so I'm just gonna, I do like that dump truck, but what happens, I do boat, we can do aquatic thing. Another thing that I want to do to make my composition more interesting is I don't want to just set things separate from each other because that's kind of boring. So when things are stacked on each other or overlapping each other, that's fun. That's more fun. What if I do the boat on the school bus? That's kind of weird, but funny. Kind of just, so, and I need to make sure I step back and actually look at how this looks on occasion. What if the patrol is in the tiny car. They're having a race. And we've got the airplane coming down. So I actually do have a ceiling where I could hang an airplane if I wanted to. Zoom. Create a family, an animal pyramid. If I'm finding that I like the objects, but they're all kind of across, I can grab like a yogurt container or something, and just paint it as a prop, right? Like I wouldn't paint all the stuff on it. I would just have it as a prop that like fades into the background so that I could have the thing that I wanted on top of it. Okay, I think I like how this is turning out. So the story is like it's kind of like sea and sky, right? So the dolphin saying hello to the boat, and then the airplane is flying through the sky, and the otter is riding on the airplane. Now, if I was turning this into an illustration, I'd use this as a reference to kind of like actually put sea and like eliminate that Kleenex box, put sky in. But we're not. We're going to do a still life. So I'm just going to paint the ground white, or I could paint it blue. I could experiment with that. But I'm going to paint the Kleenex box in. Like I'm going to paint exactly what I see. I'm going to paint the shadows on the ground. So it's going to be a still life of toys. It's not going to transform into like an illustration of how this could actually look. Let's zoom in a little. Can we see if I can tilt things? There you go. You can see. So I like how things are at an angle. I like how things are interacting. It feels like there's some good height change so that it occupies a good amount of space in the canvas. Ultimately, like I've got the fun of like the different faces and the fuzzy stuffed animals, and I've got the hard plastic surfaces. I might try switching the dolphin and the boat just because the dolphin and the otter are on the same side. So the toys are on the same side and the stuffies are on the same side. So I might switch it up just to see what happens. I think I like it the other way. I don't have a particularly good reason why. Like sometimes it's good to balance things out, but it felt a little more fun the other way. There we go. Yeah, I like how the curves and the shapes interact a little bit better. Okay, so I'm gonna leave this set up while I paint this entire still life, but I'm also gonna take a picture. Oh, before I do that, I need to experiment with lighting. So right now I've got an overhead light on, I've got a lamp to the right and a lamp to the left. The lamp on the right is the strongest, which is nice. You can see it's casting shadows to the left mostly. But sometimes having multiple lights can feel really confusing when you're trying to paint the lights and the darks. And we're going to be focusing on the lights and the darks in this. So I'm going to zoom back out again just so I can put the tripod down and you can see it. So I'm going to start I'm going to turn off the overhead light and the light on the left and just see what happens when I only have the light on the right. So you can see that the shadows get a little bit darker and the light gets a little bit simpler, which is good. You want simple light. So I'm going to play with so my lamp has some adjustable abilities. I don't know if that blows out you can start to see the lamp in there, but you get these really dramatic shadows, which is pretty fun. So I kind of like that. Yeah, I like that one light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a picture of that. Now, it's going to be hard to have that light, perfect the whole time because like it makes for a dark room and I want to be able to see what I'm doing. But so having a picture with that simpler light will be a good reference for when I want a simple light. Okay, so after this, I'm ready to get started painting. Okay, so I've got my still life and my lighting set up. And then you'll notice that I've printed off my still life, number one, so y'all can see it, because it's right over there. But then also that helps me, if I'm confused about lighting references, this can be another resource. I always want to be looking at the actual still life, but this can be a way to kind of double check if I'm confused about something, because some of the things feel a little bit simpler here. I've also printed off my inspiration, my still life inspiration, because it can be really helpful to look at like how did another painter deal with an issue. So I found a still life painter that has done a lot of toy still lifes, which is applicable to me. But then I also printed off one of the Dutch still lifes to look at, just kind of like how did they do lights and darks and reflection and things like that. So I just want to keep these kind of available as I'm painting as a resource, as an inspiration. And then I also want to have that picture of my still life available as well. So the first thing I want to do is sketch it on my canvas. So I don't have canvases. I'm going to be doing all my paintings on watercolor paper, which will warp. Believe me, you'll have a much more fun time actually painting on canvas. But so the demos will be on watercolor paper, but the techniques and things recommended will be applicable. So I want to sketch like the basics of my still life on my paper. I can either do that with a pencil, or I can actually do that with like a gray paint and a small paintbrush, whichever one you're comfortable with. One of the things to be aware of is that if you're using a pencil on canvas, number one, don't dig hard because you'll gouge a divot in the canvas and that will show through in your painting. Even with paper, I can gouge it if I push too hard. So you want to draw lightly. You also just be aware it's harder to erase on canvas. Not impossible, just harder. However, if you did sketch with a paintbrush and paint and made a mistake, or if you sketch with pencil and smudge it everywhere, acrylic paint is opaque, which means that if you make mistakes, you can paint over the top of them and you can cover them up. This is one of the wonderful things about acrylic paint. Watercolor, not so much. Once you make a mistake, you're stuck with it. But with acrylic paint, you can always paint over it. And that's really nice. Okay, so I've got kind of essentially three main things. I've got this block of boat, dolphin. I've got the box, the Kleenex box, and the otter and the airplane, but they kind of form their own kind of unit together. I want, so one thing I need to evaluate is as I look at my still life, is it going to make more sense to paint it portrait orientation? Is it a much more up and down still life, like a flower in a vase? Or is it a side to side, a landscape orientation painting? So you want to think about like, we want to fill, we don't want to go all the way to the edges, but we kind of want to fill the space of the canvas really nicely. And so figure out, like, are you more horizontal or are you more vertical, and do that appropriately. Now, what I'm going to do just to help me make sure that I fill my space well is I'm going to just really lightly sketch in, push this over, like just the shapes as I, like the giant shapes, so that I can feel like, okay, am I getting kind of even spaces on okay, that feels good, right? Like there's sort of even space. It's not too close to the edge, but it's also not tiny. Inside it fills the canvas nicely. I'm gonna draw my horizon line where the two papers meet, because that just helps create a sense of grounding. And I'm gonna erase this line. But again, remember, I can paint over it, so no big deal. And then at this point, I'm just going to do as much sketching as makes me feel confident to start painting. So Okay, it's not perfect, but you know, this isn't a drawing class, so we're not going to sit here and work too hard. I mean, we want it to, like, you want to look at it and you want to get it as realistic as possible, but you know, the reality is I've made my airplane a little bit fatter than it should be. My boat's a little bit smaller and slightly out of proportion. But for the most part, things are in the right place. They kind of look how I want them to look. They look like what's going on here. I'm doing my best to model it off of like what I actually see. For a while there, I thought I'd change the angle of the little, I'm totally losing the word on that thing, the little thing that flips around. But so it's different in the still life than I see it in the picture. So I'm drawing it how I see it currently in the still life, because really the reality is it's so hard to make things up. So look at what you see. And erase the lines that will confuse you. And if there's extraneous lines that won't confuse you, no worries, as long as they're not too dark. If they're too dark, and you're drawing on a light surface, you might want to think about like trying to make them lighter. But it's not too big a deal. So the next thing is we're gonna do the background. So I'm gonna get, you wanna paint, even though I have a light background. So if I look at my, my theme is kind of air and sea. So I think I'm gonna do like a light bluish gray up top and maybe like a slightly darker bluish gray on the bottom. I don't wanna go too blue. Gray is a wonderful background color. If you don't know what to do, just like a medium gray is spectacular. It allows your colors and your values to really pop out. But that's the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get that background value in. What's most important is the value. Next is the colors. If you want to put the colors in now, you can. But again, this process of painting, especially with our objects, is we're going to do all the values first, the darks and the lights, the blacks, whites, and grays. And we're going to get those perfect. We're going to get the textures perfect. And then we're going to add the colors later on. But if you want to put the color in your background now, you can choose to do that. Okay, so just a reminder, what do I have? I have brushes, paint brushes. I've got my disposable palette. So the colors that I've chosen are white, black, a darker blue, and then this is like a grayish dark blue. But really, I could mix the colors I want with just white, black, and blue. I also have my retarder, this thing that slows it down, slows the dry time down and makes your paint a little more flexible to work with. And I've got the gloss medium. I've got my paper towel, and I've got my paint, or my water tub, and I've got an extra piece of paper if I need to test anything out. So first thing I want to do is mix up the color I want. I think ideally you paint from top to bottom, but I think I'm going to start with the darker color and then add white to it to make sure that it's the same tone. Because if I add, because my color is in the dark thing, so it'll be harder to make it darker. It'll be easier to make it lighter. So I'm just going to start by grabbing chunks of things. And when I say darker, I really don't mean that dark. Okay. So again, I'm going for kind of a darker, oceany, bluish gray. That's a little too blue, so I'm going to add a little more black and white. And again, sometimes it's hard to tell exactly, like sometimes it's easy to tell, like, yes, this is the color I want. Sometimes it's hard to tell, so that's where that sheet of paper is. So I can sort of take a look. And with this painting process, it's always easier to go darker than it is to go, well, I said that with this process, you're going to glaze over things, and that's going to make some things darker. So you want to kind of start out a little bit maybe lighter than you really intended. So I'm going to, just in case, add a little more white. Also, since I'm covering a large surface, it's always, you want to make sure that you're mixing up enough paint. When I start painting, for example, the airplane or the otter, which kind of looks a little bit more like a teddy bear right now, but that's okay. I don't need to mix up a lot of paint. They're small areas, but right now I'm covering all of the background, so I really want to make sure I have enough paint. I'm going to add retarder because that's going to make this, since I'm painting a large surface and this is going to sit on here for a while, that's going to help keep the paint flexible. And that looks good. So, oops, grab this, clean off my palette knife, keep it clean. Okay, so when I'm painting in the background, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to paint my edges. And if I go over a little bit, that's okay, because when we paint these things, we're going to go back over the background. Again, with acrylic, we're doing opaque layers for the first part of this process. So what I don't want is I don't want this awkward space between here's the background and it ends right here, and here's my painting and it ends right here, and I get this like white area of canvas in between the two layers of paint. That's called ghosting. It looks really awkward. It's really unprofessional. Always better to like make sure things overlap just a tiny bit. And again, I'm trying to create smooth edges and make sure that my paint is not bumpy. Again, I'm right-handed, so I probably should have started on this side. Otherwise, I drag my hand across wet paint. That's something you always want to be careful of. When I'm painting an edge, you can start out and then work in towards the edge a little bit. And that makes it easier to control how the paintbrush works. And if I made a little mistake there, but that's okay. I can paint over it when I do the Kleenex box. Okay, now this brush is, well, it's kind of like medium small, I would call it. It's not small, small. But it would take a long time to finish out. It's helpful to use the small brush to get all those like perfect details of the line in, but it would take a longer time to fill out this space. So I'm going to transition, I'm going to clean that brush off and transition to a bigger brush, which will help me fill the space in quicker. And since I don't need to worry about edges, I can kind of, it's good to kind of overlap a little bit. With backgrounds, I like to alternate vertical and horizontal strokes because it makes sure you don't get like weird looking kind of strokes going in like diagonals or odd directions. It helps keep it more uniform. One thing you'll notice, the paint that has dried is darker than the paint I am currently painting. Acrylic usually dries a little bit darker, so that's something, again, like I said, it's always better to start with mixing paint. It's easier to mix paint from dark to light. With painting, you want to keep your painting as light as possible and then make it darker later on. If the distinction between those two things makes sense, that it will continue to get darker as you keep adding more paint. So making your paints lighter at the beginning will make it easier for you towards the end to be able to control your values. Okay, so now I'm going to add white to this and a little bit more medium, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing to paint in the background on the top. I do want to be careful that I make sure that these edges are dry when I paint into them. Otherwise, I will pick up the wet paint and mix it into my light paint. So anytime you start, even though this is kind of a new area, technically it's a layer that's over the top of this layer. Anytime you do a layer over the top, you want to make sure the bottom layer is dry. It should be, by the time I mix this up and I can start up here, it should be plenty dry, and that should be fine. Okay, I've painted the background in. One of the reasons we do that first is, I mean, number one, it's just really exciting to get a lot of paint on the canvas quickly, and it starts to feel like, okay, the painting is coming together. Number two, it's really hard to do the background after you've gotten your subject matter, the objects in your still life, painted nicely. You have a tendency to lose all your beautiful edges if you paint the background in after. Now, like I said, it's easy to make acrylic paint darker than you intend. So this is a darker background than I had intended. And if I want it to be lighter, that's a change that I should probably make now rather than later. It's not impossible to do it later, but it is harder to do it later. However, I think I'm going to go with this for now. I think it'll work. But that's just something to be aware of. Like, take a look, and it's, you know, it's hard to imagine it perfectly because you don't know how the background will interact until you paint the objects in. But that is something, like, if you know you want it lighter or darker, let it dry and then do another layer over the top that pushes it in the direction that you want it to go. One thing I'm noticing as the background dries, that it is a little bit streaky. So it could be a good thing to, after you do your background, let it dry and come back to it while your paint's still on the palette and see if there's any areas you need to touch up. For me, the streakiness feels like pretty even, so I'm just going to let it be a part of the background, and that's okay. Okay, so after I do the background, my goal is essentially to turn this into a black and white photograph. And I'm going to start by doing what I call the main values. So I'm not going to worry about like the tiny lights and darks or the tiny details. I'm going to kind of look at what are the like lights, what are the darks, what are the mediums, what are the medium darks, medium lights, etc., and kind of get some of the bigger values. I'm not worried about color. Now, if you're struggling with like interpreting values from a color photograph, there's a couple things you can do. If you squint your eyes, it's easier to see the relative lights and darks. Or you can actually turn your photograph into a black and white photograph and then print that out and look at that. And that can be really helpful. For now, what I'm going to do is I've got white and dark and black, and I am just going to mix up a range of like, I'm not going to do anything pure black or pure white right now. But I'm going to start with kind of a much darker gray. I'll just use all my black there. Mix in some of that retarder. And then I'm going to mix a variety of values on my palette so that I can kind of go back and forth in pulling from them. So there, hopefully you can see that I've got not pure black or pure white, but I've got 4 different values, like a dark gray, medium to dark gray, medium light, and light gray. And then I can start looking at, like, if I look at this, my areas of darkness are the dark parts of the brown of the otter, the dark parts of the airplane, dark right here. What I would say would be medium dark is this Kleenex box, maybe the blue part of the ship that's actually on the lighter side, the brown area of the otter that hits the light, the blue, the dark blue of the dolphin, and this area that's in the shadow. And then the medium light would be some of the areas that are lighter but are in the shadow. And then the light gray would be like, especially the area under here, this white area or the wings, the areas that catch the light that are already lit. Again, I'm not going to worry too much about details. What I want to do is get kind of a base layer value, and then we'll do some more layers over the top. But because we're doing so many layers, I want to be careful that I'm doing thin layers. So I might add a little bit of extra water when I paint. It's okay if they're streaky. I'd rather them be thin and streaky than bumpy, because I'm going to be fighting that later on. And again, don't worry about color. This is just black and white. Okay, so at this point, I have my whole painting painted. The canvas is covered, which is awesome. It's really good to get to that stage. And you can start to vaguely see the forms taking shape, where the light and the dark falls across these objects. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then we're gonna go back in and we're gonna kind of attack each object by object. We're gonna really focus in on the details of each object. The nice thing about watering down some of the paints is that I can still see my pencil lines through. So that'll help me when I'm doing some more of the details. But if I covered up some of my pencil lines, that's okay. I can always rediscover where things need to go and how they need to be.